Sun Tzu said that the best military policy is to attack strategy. But how do you attack a strategy? And is attacking the U.S. strategy why the Taliban is winning the Afghan war? Hello, my name's John LeMay and welcome to my basement war room. This is a video in the series The Great Military Philosophers on Afghanistan. And today I'm diving into Chapter 3 of The Art of War, Planning the Attack. After we discuss Chapter 3 a little bit, then I'll take a look at an example from the Afghan War on how do you attack an alliance. And after looking at how to attack an alliance, I'll also use the Afghan War to sort of illustrate how you attack a strategy. Then I'll finish up with some references and conclude. Okay, so let's dive into Chapter 3. So here are four of the major themes, I think, from Chapter 3, Planning the Attack. I'm only going to deep dive the top one in the next boards, but I'll talk about each of these briefly right now. So the first, therefore, the best military policy is to attack strategies, the next to attack alliances, the next to attack soldiers, and the worst to assault walled cities, from the Ames translation. So we'll jump into that in just a minute. The great commander crushes the enemy's state. Without a protracted war, he must use the principle of keeping himself intact to compete in the world. So Sun Tzu is against protraction. That was the major theme of Chapter 2. Protraction is bad, and he continues that here in Chapter 3. And again, during Sun Tzu's time, the Warring States period of China, there were numerous near-peer competitors all next to each other. So if one state went to war against another, even if it won, if it's was not intact, right? If the army was not intact after that battle, a different state would just swoop in and take advantage of it. So to compete in the world, you have to stay intact. Don't protract the war. Okay, the side on which the commander is able and the ruler does not interfere will take the victory. This is often used, sort of quoted without any context, to justify unleashing the military. No political interference. Let the brilliant generals run wild and keep the dumb politicians out of it. However, that is certainly not the American tradition. The American tradition is civilian control of the military. And just to think of two cases, what would have happened in the Civil War if Abraham Lincoln hadn't had his hand firmly on the rudder? What would the outcome of the Korean War be if Truman hadn't fired MacArthur? So that, I think Sun Tzu is actually more nuanced than just this quote on this issue. And when we look at Clausewitz and later on in Sun Tzu, I think we'll have the opportunity to dive a lot deeper into political authority and military operations. He who knows the enemy and himself will never in 100 battles be at risk. In Chapter 10, Sun Tzu adds terrain. So he who knows the enemy, himself, and the terrain will win. And so we'll come back to this in Chapter 10, but this is a great principle of military art and science, for sure. Okay, so those are some of the major themes from Chapter 3, Planning an Attack. Now let's look at how do you attack an alliance. So my example is from the war in Afghanistan, and it's insider attacks or green on blue attacks. What the Taliban will do in these attacks is take a member, someone's loyal to the Taliban, and infiltrate them into the Afghan National Defense Security Forces. And then that person will, when they're working with or being trained by U.S. or NATO forces, turn around and shoot the people that are working with or training them. So shoot the U.S. or NATO soldiers. This is mostly a suicide attack because then either loyal Afghans or other U.S. and NATO forces quickly shoot, kill, or capture the insider. But these insider attacks have really driven a wedge in the alliance. Now, let's talk about their military significance. I argue that from an impact on the organization of the U.S. Army, or a modern military organization, these attacks are not significant. I just want to be clear, I think every life is infinitely valuable. You can't quantify the value of a person's life. But I think we can step back and try and look at how losses affect military organizations and then making a judgment on their effectiveness. So to do that, let's compare the Battle of Okinawa and the Afghan War. So Battle of Okinawa, 82 days, 82,000 casualties, 12,500 dead. That's U.S. And we won. At the end, the U.S. Army and U.S. Marine Corps were still well intact and had taken Okinawa and won the battle. And so Afghan War, 18 years, 20,000 casualties, 2,400 dead. And of those 2,400, only a small fraction, a couple hundred, are from insider attacks. So they're really not militarily significant. They're not going to stop the U.S. Army, make it combat ineffective. I mean, this rate of casualties, as you can see from taking this in 82 days as opposed to 18 years, I mean, the U.S. Army can absorb a lot of casualties and still continue the fight. So from that perspective, they don't do a lot. However, they're very effective at attacking the alliance. Let me read a little from the Washington Post to sort of draw this out. So this is a Washington Post article from October 24th, 2018. American military officials said Wednesday that they had halted most face-to-face contacts with members of the Afghan security forces and had temporarily withdrawn from Afghan security facilities after two insider shootings in the past week that killed a top Afghan regional police commander and a Czech soldier. A spokesman for Resolute Support, the U.S.-led military mission in Afghanistan, described the move as standard practice after green-on-blue attacks or assaults by Afghan security personnel against foreign forces. He said regular contacts were continuing by telephone and email between U.S. and Afghan security officials, and some meetings were also taking place in U.S. facilities. Okay, so can you imagine having an effective alliance that coordinates a war by telephone and email, and that this is a routine practice, that this happens all the time? We leave the presence of each other or stay away from each other and just go to telephone and email. I mean, these insider attacks had a significant effect on the Afghan war. It really impaired U.S. and NATO abilities to train and raise cohesive Afghan formations and to be with them and to do things with them. And just from the U.S. perspective, I mean, think about U.S. NATO advisors all have to have quote-unquote guardian angels. They have to have soldiers present protecting them from the people that they're training. It's not an effective alliance, and it's all because of these insider attacks. So the Taliban has successfully attacked the U.S.-NATO alliance with the Afghan National Defense Security Forces. Okay, we talked about that. Now let's talk about how do you attack strategy. Okay, so first I'm going to give a 2016 snapshot of the strategies of some of the major actors in the Afghan war. Okay, so in this little drawing here, you have Pakistan, the safe haven the Taliban's operating out of. They're fighting over into Afghanistan. The Taliban can sort of control the rural area, and the government of Afghanistan, Jaroa, government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, controls the urban areas. The Taliban strategy is protraction. So they want to slowly erode Afghan security forces until the correlation of forces is equal or they have an advantage. And after they kill off enough of them, wear them down, and they get that appropriate correlation or an advantage, then they'll go to a more conventional form of war and take the urban areas that are well protected by significant Afghan formations. Jaroa's strategy is fight, fracture, talk. And so they want to fight the Taliban, inflict some significant battlefield victories, some casualties, and then through those victories entice sub-fractions of the Taliban to break off and reconcile with Jaroa and come over to the government. So they want to fight them, fracture them, and talk with them. And as an aside, obviously, fracture is what we just talked about. Jaroa is trying to fracture the Taliban's internal alliances. Then the U.S. is train, advise, and assist JAROA and do counterterrorism operations against terrorist organizations. Of interest, in 2016, the Taliban is not a terrorist organization. And so the U.S. is doing direct action against Al-Qaeda, for example, but not directly fighting the Taliban, just letting JAROA do all the fighting against the Taliban, except in cases of strategic emergency where the Taliban's about to take a major urban area. So, an example of attacking this strategy is Taliban attacks during NATO conferences. Again, the US or NATO strategy is train, advise, assist, and to do that, NATO has these conferences where they get member nations to donate troops, to pledge troops over a certain period of time, and to donate money, to pledge money to the Afghan government. And so when NATO has these conferences, the Taliban try and do highly visible attacks on urban areas that cause strategic emergencies, to sow doubt, to encourage NATO members not to pledge, not to send their troops. And so they're attacking this train, advise, assist strategy by trying to convince the foreign forces not to train, advise, and assist the Afghans. An example from the U.S. perspective is training an Afghan Air Force. So Taliban strategy, eventually they have to come out of guerrilla warfare and go to a conventional phase to retake the urban areas. They can't ever do that when NATO's present because NATO owns the air, and anything that NATO can identify they can destroy. So anything that looks like a large grouping of Taliban warriors coming together to form a conventional army would immediately be destroyed from the air. So the Taliban are forced to stay in a guerrilla mode where NATO can't distinguish them from the population and identify them. Giving the Afghan Air Force the same capability is a strategy to prevent the Taliban from ever going into that phase, that conventional phase of the war. And as an aside, we'll talk a lot more about this when we dive into Mao. This is a very quick and simple overview of the strategies involved, really just to help give you enough background to make an argument that, hey, training an Afghan Air Force attacks the Taliban strategy, and highly visible attacks in urban areas attacks NATO's strategy. Okay, I've talked a little bit about how you attack a strategy, and as a note, it's hard to draw out practical, realistic examples of how to attack a strategy. So if you've got some examples, please share them. Put them in the forum in the new group I just created, the Lessons on the Iraq and Afghanistan War. Okay, so in conclusion, let me just hit a couple references. So Giles here translates this part about attack alliances as prevent the junction of forces, which is a little weird, doesn't resonate with me. Both Ames and Griffith translate that. So I also use Griffith here to sort of say, hey, what's he say and what's Ames say? They both translate it attack alliances. So those three texts are the references on Sun Tzu. I also looked at some 2016 stuff for the strategy. So General Nicholson's press statement, 6 July 2016, and President Obama's speech, 28 July 2016. Hey, if this has been of value to you, please do join that Facebook group I mentioned. I've been looking for an effective way to try and get some discussion going, to get more interaction, really share the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I believe, rather than just post randomly, that this group will help that. So please join the Facebook group, Lessons of the Iraq and Afghanistan War. And if this is value to you, if you want to look a little bit deeper, get some sort of behind the scenes look at how I'm putting this together, what the objectives are, what I'm planning, please sign up for the newsletter. Thank you very much for joining me today.